to Adam, and then everything else is the covenant of grace, or is it? There's a debate among the Reformed, and how much of this is coming from the sort of Westminster West. How much of this is republication? Maybe not much. Maybe it's just this overemphasis on the creational or the because Robertson and others would see in the Noahic covenant elements of common grace, of something that's being reaffirmed in the Adamic covenant. But at the same time, there is, the sacrifice. And so there's elements of the covenant of grace there as well. So I have sort of a seed starting at Adam, but then of course it's boom, all of a sudden introduced with Abraham in Genesis 12. And then the Mosaic is, we would understand that to be an administration of the covenant of grace. But we're not going to get into the reform stuff for soteriological purposes. We're going to get into this for political purposes. So again, I want to emphasize what Van Drunen is emphasizing about the Noahic covenant. It is universal, it is preservative, and it is temporary. So anything you want to try to, the kingdom is there, or new creational elements or redemptive elements, those are the things that Van Drunen is going to work hard to say, no, 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 that's not what we're doing here. Okay. And of course, if all you do is say that, who's he arguing against? Not us. So we might ask the question right away, why would a covenant of common grace, such as the Noahic covenant is being situated here, why would that kind of a covenant that preserves nature, why would that mitigate against, why would that war against the truth of divine law standing over the state? Well, in the most general terms, it wouldn't. He's getting this from the Bible, and Genesis 9 comes with a kind of law, but we mean things like the Ten Commandments, not just the moral law, but its implications running through the law of Moses. I forgot to set my timer, so I hope I don't yap past 30 minutes. But anyway, I'll get an estimate going. But anyway, why are these contradictory to begin with in his mind? And it's really the million-dollar question, at least at first, that Van Drunen, I don't think, is going to be able to answer, because in one sense, the root of the rationale is also divine law. It's in Scripture. It's Genesis 8, Genesis 9. And so he can only make his point, prove anything, by utilizing a straw man of the Christian right. And that's what I'm going to argue he and other Two Kingdom people more blaringly do. But in his, I'm picking on him because he's their best representative, and that's what you should always do. But the idea that the Christian right is imposing aspects of special grace or the new covenant on the people of common grace, that's where the argument's gonna happen. So in its defining attributes that I mentioned, that it's universal, that it's preservative, that it's temporary, Van Drunen stresses its all-inclusiveness, and that's going to be crucial as well. The absence of any decisive triumph, no crushing of the serpent's head, to use the emphasis, the Genesis 3:15 language. And it's not to be worked on, the political community, as if it's the actual permanent dominion. So if you've ever heard that term, dominionism. So we can't have any of that. Okay, so these are the just clues as to who he is arguing or what he is arguing against. That's our first answer to that question. But you might ask, as I hinted at last time, what about the image of God? And we'll see more about that. Genesis 9, that tells us something about the image of God. Doesn't that inform moral law? And doesn't that inform Western political theory and things like life, liberty, and property? To violate those is not just to violate some privately conceived individualistic rights, but that's what the law of God in the second table is stopping. So does Van Drunen see any of that? And so what he says initially about the image of God, he says, quote, the idea, this is page 58, the idea that God created human beings in his own image has been foundational for theological anthropology in the major Christian tradition. And since the image of God concerns a divine commission to rule in this world, as I argue, it is a fundamental issue for Christian political theology. Well, that doesn't tell us a whole lot, but what I'm going to tell you is that when you get to chapter 4 and he starts to root Romans 13 back into Genesis 9, the lights are going to go on and you'll see, oh, he does see the image of God in Genesis 9, but he doesn't see what traditional Western Christian political theory has seen in that. He sees not something to protect, but he sees something that was delegated only to one dude with the sword, or he sees that half of it. We'll come back to that then. I'll show you, and I'll quote and show you that it's not a straw man. Now, one of the things I see in chapters 2 and 3 is some decisive discontinuities, and I'm talking about between. So let's see. I wish I had a darker, newer black marker to make another color, but I'll try to do it with the brown here. I see two radical discontinuities that are no-nos, but you see it in his thought. There's a radical discontinuity between Genesis 1 and Genesis 8 and 9. So you notice he's rooting everything with Noah. And in one sense, we would agree with that. But we see that image of God pointing back to Genesis 1, 26 and 27. He's not going to make as much of that because of what I'll show you later, and just going to wait for that. But watch out for that. But then there's another radical discontinuity between creation and consummation. Creation and consummation. So let me just briefly explain what I mean by that. At the very least, Van Drunen is going to stress an eschatological end of everything versus subordinate ends, okay? So the Noahic covenant is restricting political projects into preserving, into an ongoing existence. So just sort of a clue there. I don't know how to draw that line, because I draw it somewhere between this and like eschatology. It's a straw man to begin with, at least applied to conservative politics. So I'm not even going to draw the line up there. He would be better to make that criticism against radical or revolutionary theories like Marxism, but he doesn't do that, at least at this point. So we'll leave that alone for a second. As we go to the aspect of chapter 2 that is setting up nature and grace and the relationship between nature and grace, this is Van Drunen's more, what he calls a more nuanced alternative, an alternative to the Thomist view and an alternative to the neo-Calvinist view, the Dutch, Kuyper, Bavinck, that whole thing. So there's parts of both that he agrees with as far as nature and grace, but then he's going to say, it's neither. I've got a better idea than Thomas or Kuyper or Bavinck had. But the idea here in the traditional view, in Thomas's view, was that grace perfects nature. So you have nature created here, going along like that. And in Thomas's view, there's an arc. Not really. That sounds post-millennial. With the post-millennials, are all excited about that, which is fine. I'm not going to trust that right now. But Thomas, of course, at least at the end, the beatific vision, but many other, the whole idea of redemption and sanctification is grace perfecting nature. Grace perfecting nature. In the neo-Calvinist view, the language was grace is restoring nature. Now, in both, they want to emphasize grace is not antithetical to nature. Grace is not eradicating nature. In other words, salvation, the gospel, Christianity is not nature hating. It's creation affirming. How so? Well, it's restoring it. What, to its original? Well, in the Thomist view, it's actually perfecting it. It's actually going to be better than the original, okay? And there's a lot of ways that this plays out in Christian theology. Special revelation presupposes natural. By the way, this is a strong point in Van Drunen, is that he's going to exalt the nature in natural law. By the way, I slipped last time. I said natural theology instead of natural law. I just remembered that, so I'm glad I remembered that correction there. But that's a strong point in Van Drunen. Now, he's going to totally butcher what it is in relation to the Mosaic law and the moral law and how that informs civil law. Nevertheless, it's a true point. But these two presuppositional pillars, that special revelation presupposes natural revelation, and that therefore even the gospel, salvation, presupposes the natural condition and the law. So those are presuppositions of grace and supernature and where we're headed. These two presuppositional pillars lead one to consider natural law as foundational in the whole Christian worldview. Natural law as foundational, but also it leads one to consider the Noahic covenant and the new covenant in a sharp dichotomy. And that's where Van Drunen is going to depart. And he's been hammering that hard in the early going, is a radical discontinuity between the Noahic and the New Covenant. So, and that's so far what I've distinguished by these two circles. Okay, so how does nature precede grace? How does nature precede grace? Well, nature precedes grace in two ways. And I have no more room on the board to write into this unless I turn around too much. But historically, number one, historically, God's work of creation preceded his work of redemption. So I think that would be very uncontroversial, that creation came before redemption. Paul says that, the natural comes before the supernatural in 1 Corinthians 15. Okay, but then secondly, theoretically, Van Drunen says, not just historically, but theoretically, nature precedes grace in that a theology of redemption presupposes a theology of creation. Machen made that same point against the liberals. I'm not going to go into the details of how he did that, but at any rate, these are points that we would agree with. But again, it's what he's doing with it that's the issue. You just got to develop this art of discernment. So how does now, what about Thomas and the Neo-Calvinists? Why did I even bring that up? Why is he bringing it up? How does he agree and yet at the same time transcend Thomas? Okay, remember that was grace perfects nature. Well, for Thomas, grace does not destroy nature, but perfects it. And for the Neo-Calvinists, for Bavinck, is I think where he pokes at here more than Kuyper. But for Bavinck, the notion that the what's called the donum superadditum, which Van Drunen is going to poke at and say that Bavinck was kind of straw manning the Thomist view a little bit, but he represented it as too negative of a view of created nature and too weak a view of the fall into sin. So how do these go together? How do these views go together in Van Drunen's thought? Well, let me fast forward here because I only have so much time. I'm trying to get chapters 2 through 4, but so I want to fast forward. Basically, he says Bavinck's view, the Neo-Calvinist view, only gets you back into Adam's original shoes. So it only restores nature. So he's going to agree with Thomas a little bit there. But what I want to get to, what's his final synthesis? Why is he bringing it up? Well, in the end, Van Drunen lands on this formula. He says on page 76, I suggest a better formula. Common grace, I don't know if these are my parentheses, the word common or not, but anyway, common or grace, it is right. Common grace preserves nature and saving grace consummates nature. Did you catch what he's doing? He's still doing this. So everything he's doing is to build this radical dichotomy, okay? Common grace preserves nature. That's all it does. Special grace restores, perfects, consummates nature. It's the final kingdom. Don't confuse those. Well, I agree with that. Don't confuse those. Okay? But notice this little divide and conquer strategy here. This analysis of the Thomist view and the Neo-Calvinist view is just really a lot of divide and conquer going on here. And he does more than simply do historical analysis here. He does more than synthesize into some holistic picture. He uses the opportunity to dichotomize nature and grace. And this whole time I'm trying to figure out how to draw this left to right. Problem with left to right. Normally, the way Schaeffer did it when Schaeffer was botching up Thomas, because Schaeffer just followed Van Til, and Van Til didn't read Thomas, but still talked about him wrongly, is they did this. Let's see. Grace above the line, nature below the line. But in the words of Schaeffer, Thomas had nature eat up grace because he had an insufficient view of the fall. And if you're a Van Tillian, you already know what I'm talking about here. So I guess nature eating up grace, going like this, I guess, in natural theology. Well, I don't know how to depict that with Van Til, except that there's going to be a radical dichotomy. I'm guessing that what Van Drunen would say that the Christian right does